Okay, everyone, welcome to our afternoon panel sessions. Those of you joining from the bus and the tour, I hope you had a great time on that. We're here for this panel on accessing vacant land for food production and this issue of land access. And you always need somewhere to produce food, and this is a particularly poignant issue when it comes to urban agriculture, because this is what makes urban agriculture different than agriculture in general, right? It has to be in the urban setting. So we're getting three really nice different perspectives on the issue of having access to the land for these endeavors here. And so we're gonna build to, in the end, hearing some direct experience in Baltimore, but starting more generally for that. And with the panelists' permission, I'm going to give rather short introductions so we can get right down to it. Just a word on format. We'll hear from everyone, their presentations, and then we'll open up to a general discussion in the room. And so first, we'll be hearing from Tonya Lewis, who is with SUNY Buffalo Law School, and she'll be leading us off. After that, we'll be hearing from Becky Witt, who's with the Community Law Center. And then finally, Elder Wendall Holmes from Strength to Love 2 will be our final presenter. And again, after that, we'll have the group discussion about these issues of access to vacant land. So, with my promise to be short, I'm done with my introduction. And Todd?
Is there a mouse?
Yes, it should be tied into the hand.
Is this a clicker? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, right after lunch. Hopefully I can keep you awake. My name is Tonya Lewis, as Mr. Pappas said, and I'm from SUNY Buffalo. I did my law school degree there in 2010, and then I went on to do my Ph.D., which I'm defending on Tuesday, and my research is in the area of environmental justice. And so in doing so, I've become active with a number of the advocacy groups in Buffalo, and I've been involved a bit in the urban agricultural movement there and have been witnessing the expansion of that. And so I'm going to talk today specifically on land banks. I've been working with Jessica Ali, who's a professor in the law school, and we've written a couple of papers on the property tools for accessing land for urban agriculture, and the most recent one is on land banks. Okay, so before I get into land banks and how they can help us put property into the hands of urban farmers, I'm going to talk a bit about a couple of the organizations in Buffalo. So the first is the Farmer Pirates of Buffalo, which is kind of a cool name since they're trying to steal land. And so the Farmer Pirates are a cooperative of 4 farms, and they originated when they went in together to have horse bedding trucked in for compost. So they started working together, and now they share resources, seeds, etc. But they have grown to now hold more than 10 acres of land in common within the city, and a total of over 30 previously vacant lots. And these lots are no longer in the hands of speculators. So one thing that's happening in Buffalo is we are seeing some people moving back into the city. And so although that's very exciting, one of the results of that is that speculators are coming in and they're buying up property. So they're maintaining the taxes and they're sort of taking care of it. So the city's not taking it away from them. So how can we get this land and put it back into the hands of the people? So in addition to shared ownership, the Farmer Pirates have long-term leases on some of the parcels that they use to farm. And these farms are located in low-income neighborhoods on Buffalo's east side. And the farm even accepts food stamps for trees and plants that are fruit-bearing because they want to help the community to become self-sufficient. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. And a second farm in Buffalo is the Massachusetts Avenue Project, or MAP for short. And this farm covers 13 lots and over an acre of reclaimed land in Buffalo's west side. And this is predominantly a low income and highly immigrated. population. And so one of the cool things about the large number of immigrants in the community is they're teaching others how to farm. So the Burmese immigrants have these beautiful crops, and people are walking by their garden saying, how did you do that? So there's this real interchange of knowledge that's going on there, which is exciting. So this particular farm has a 10,000-gallon rain catchment system, 2 greenhouses, urban chickens, a compost system, and an aquaponics system. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's where fish and plants are raised in a symbiotic environment. So they have these large fish tanks with plants growing in them at the same time. And the farm has a growing green program in which it employs local youth and educates them on farming practices, healthy eating, fresh and local food, and social enterprise through the distribution of their produce to local restaurants and retail enterprises. So they have a couple of restaurants right across the street that they sell to, and that's an outdoor market in the lower right-hand corner. Okay, so moving into land banks. The city of Buffalo, like many Rust Belt cities, has a lot of vacant properties and structures. In fact, they have 13 vacant parcels, just lots, 4,000 vacant structures, and 22,000 vacant residential units. And so the result, as we know of this, is lost revenue to local government and large costs ranging from the demolition costs and the continued deterioration of neighborhoods and maintenance costs too. So where cities are facing these crises of vacant and abandoned properties, often carrying tax delinquencies, maintenance costs, and clouded titles, the establishment of a land bank can foster the redevelopment of these properties. So a land bank generally is a government-run bank. So it's a bank that can acquire, hold properties, and then put it back into the hands of the public with clear title. So it takes this tax delinquent property, secures it perhaps by demolishing structures on it, and identifies the best long-term use for the property. So the land bank can either hold the property for interim use, or it can then transfer it back to the public with clear title. So how do states establish land banks? Well, they have to do so first by statutory authority. And so in doing so, they can either make the land bank a governmental entity, or it can become a new distinct legal entity. So state statutes specify the structure and the power of the land banks within the state. So they can specify that the land bank be available to specific counties, cities, or particular metropolitan areas. So such as the Buffalo-Niagara metropolitan area, the 2 cities can have one land bank that would be applicable to both cities, or they can have their own distinct. But once you define the geographic range of the land bank, it can only acquire properties within that particular geographic range. And so the statute also will typically identify the source of funding used to support the land bank. And this is especially important because startup is very difficult for the land banks. Once they've been established, they can create revenue through their daily services. They can also, if the statute allows for it, they can receive income from investments. And New York has even gone so far as to say that the land bank can keep up to 50% of the revenue from the new tax revenue that will be received as a result of selling the property. So the land bank will acquire a property that's been tax delinquent, and then once it sells it, it can actually be paid up to 50% of the future tax revenue for a period of up to 5 years. So you can see that once the land bank is established, it can be self-sustaining, but it takes a bit for it to get off the ground, and that can be an obstacle. So what powers does the land bank have? Well, in New York, they can acquire property from donations, purchase contracts, lease purchase agreements, and transfers from municipalities. So they can acquire the land in a variety of ways. And the land bank can focus on particular properties to acquire, so they can create this hierarchy of desired properties. So Binghamton, New York's land bank, they focus on properties that are highly visible within community gateways, so highly traveled corridors. Also prominent sites that have a blighting influence on a neighborhood, old brownfield sites, historic sites, and those suitable for bundling together to make larger tracts for future development. So this is key for cities such as Buffalo. When you have a lot of these properties that are spatially disjointed, and maybe at a later date they might want to reserve an area for certain types of development, they can start acquiring this land now and hold on to it and develop it in the future. So how can land banks help with urban agriculture? Well, in addition to creating a hierarchy of properties that they want to acquire, they can also create a hierarchy of how they want to develop the land in the future. So when they rank these priorities, for example, a city may choose to prioritize affordable housing and therefore sell the land first to developers that will bring in new housing and new residents into the city. And that's important in a lot of the Rust Belt cities. Some cities also prioritize green uses. So in the city of Philadelphia, they can offer properties at below market value for a broad range of intended uses, including community facilities that provide needed services to residents, side and rear yards, innovation in design and sustainability, community open space, and urban agriculture. So if the city of Philadelphia, in the creation of its land bank, has defined urban agriculture as one of its priority uses, this is great for folks that want to pick up parcels for the purpose of urban agriculture. And to get this property at below market value in some instances can be great. And so in New York, the New York State Land Bank Act or statute for the disposition of property, this is their hierarchy. So used for purely public spaces and places, used for affordable housing, retail, commercial, and industrial activities, wildlife conservation areas, and lastly, such other uses and in such hierarchical order as determined by the foreclosing governmental unit or units. Foreclosing governmental unit just means tax district. So Cleveland established their Cuyahoga land bank in 2009 to address the city's some 15,000 vacant and abandoned properties. And this is another point, this idea of land banking is fairly recent. It's really only evolved in the last decade or so, and New York's statute was only originated in 2011. So in terms of Cleveland, in line with their city mission of becoming a green city on the Blue Lake, which is kind of catchy, neighborhood groups, churches, schools, and individuals can apply for funding and technical assistance to transform vacant lots held by the bank into community gardens or other green land uses. So here in this particular farm, the Rising Harvest Farm in Cleveland, they have a 25-year lease through the land bank to operate on this property. And the property is located on a site of an old school that was torn down. And they have a lot of really great community programs there, vocational training, etc. They now have expanded to have chickens and bees. And you can see on the map from the aerial image, it's kind of cool how it's nestled right in the middle of this big residential neighborhood, and a lot of people have access to it. And so they now have 24 plots for public use that the public can rent out and farm their own plots. And the land bank even contributes $14,000 annually for the irrigation of this property. So we saw this today on the tour. Irrigation is a big issue. So how are they going to pay to water the crops? And this land bank donates $14,000 a year for that. So that's really exciting. Okay, so potential drawbacks of a land bank. Are there any drawbacks? Well, there are a couple perhaps. So first, where a city or municipality can create their own hierarchy, it can also discourage the development of urban agriculture or transferring these plots for that particular purpose. Sometimes a city might want a shiny new building and new residents over what they might see as another tomato patch, right? And so it's important that they include some sort of desire to have green development within their code, and hopefully that won't be a deterrent to using it for this purpose. And the other potential drawback is the redundancy of organizations that hold and maintain properties. So in Buffalo, for example, we have three. We have an urban development corporation through the city that holds housing and sells it and is responsible for maintaining it. And we also have a public housing authority. And so now we have a land bank. So now we have three organizations, and where is the redundancy in the daily activities of these organizations? And what about funding? So if the land bank isn't funded, it's not going to be successful. The land bank in Buffalo currently has one property. So that's not really ideal in terms of a land bank, and it has one staff member. New York State, however, currently allows for up to 10 land banks in the state, and we have 8. And this year, this spring, the Attorney General increased that number to 20, so we can develop up to 12 additional land banks, and he allocated an additional $20 million in funding. Interestingly, the funding is coming from the housing crash and the settlement from the big banks. So now the big banks are paying to get this property back into tax-paying hands. So that's kind of interesting. But those are the two potential issues that I found in my research regarding that. So that's it.
So, good afternoon. My name is Becky Witt. I'm staff attorney at Community Law Center. And Community Law Center represents community associations and other nonprofit groups. We mostly work in Baltimore City. So I'm kind of coming at this from the community perspective of how to get access to land in Baltimore City. And I'm kind of going to go over all the different ways that I could think of. Maybe you can think of other ways in your town that you can get access to land legally. And then I'm going to focus on one way in particular, which is the way that most farmers and gardeners get access to land in this town, which is through the Adopt-a-Lot license agreement, and talk a little bit about that. So first is my overview. One way to get access to land is through a lease, and you can do this for either privately owned land by contacting the landowner and working that out. I'm sure all of us are kind of familiar with the process of leasing property, or you can lease in Baltimore City through the Homegrown Baltimore program. And Elder Holmes from Strength to Love is going to be able to talk a little bit more about that process with us that he has gone through to lease land for 7 years, essentially, from the city. Only certain kinds of groups are eligible for that program. It's kind of a special program. So that's the only way that you can lease land from Baltimore City that's publicly owned currently. The way that almost everybody gets access to land is through a license agreement. And you can, this is equally, you can get one if it's a privately owned piece of land. Basically, license just means permission to be on a piece of land. So if you get permission from the landowner to be there and to grow food, you have a license. The way to get a license for publicly owned land is through the Adopt-a-Lot program. And probably a lot of the cities that you're from, if you're not from Baltimore, have similar programs with the Adopt-a-Lot. And that's what I'm going to be kind of focusing a lot of my time on today. You can purchase land, obviously, privately owned. That is all a private matter, but the city does sell a lot of the land that it currently owns through its Vacants to Value program. Self-help nuisance abatement is something that we've kind of pioneered. I shouldn't say we, because I don't want to take credit for it, but Community Law Center has kind of helped groups to do this. Basically, if you live in a neighborhood and there's a vacant piece of land that is a nuisance and that's interfering with your quiet enjoyment of your own land, then the law gives you permission under certain conditions to go on to that other person's land and abate the nuisance. So we've used this to do kind of clean and green of vacant lots, and some groups have taken it so far as to actually start gardens on lots that don't belong to them but are privately owned. And this kind of works the best when the landowner doesn't care about the property. We haven't had to really defend this in court very much, so it's untested, but we think could hold up pretty well. And then one final way, and this is also kind of an alternative method of getting land, and it takes a very long time, is through adverse possession. So for those of you who are not familiar with adverse possession, basically it's, most people have kind of an idea of what squatters' rights are. So through adverse possession, if you go onto a piece of land that does not belong to you and use it as though it did belong to you for a certain period of time, and each state is different, after a certain amount of years, you can file a lawsuit to clear the title and to take title to the property.
Because of squatters?
Yeah, so that's, people kind of colloquially sometimes call it squatters' rights. In some states the time period is not very long. It might be only 5 years, but in most states it's something like 20 years. In Maryland it's 20 years. So we've been hearing, I don't think Amy Laura is here, but in Philadelphia there are some groups that have been using the same piece of land for a garden since the 30s and 40s, and some groups, maybe just one group in Philadelphia, has actually been able to use adverse possession to get title to a privately owned property that they had been using continuously for a long, long time. This is not an easy tool to use, but it's an interesting one, and I think one that we might be able to use more. So I'm going to be talking a lot about license agreements, what they are, and maybe how they can be improved. And so I'm going to be talking about them in the context of Baltimore City. It's possible that license agreements in your city might work completely differently, but this is kind of a process that we've been going through with communities over the past year and a half. So a license, like I said, is permission to do something that otherwise you wouldn't have the right to do. So if a piece of land is privately owned, you don't have the right to go onto it without permission. That's called trespass. We all kind of have an idea of what that means. And so if the landowner gives you permission to be on the land, then that's a license. And it can be extremely informal. It can basically just mean, sure, you can come onto my land for this purpose. Or it can be a written agreement. And this is a copy of the Adopt-A-Lot license agreement that the city gives to people who want to adopt properties that the city owns. So the Adopt-A-Lot program, basically when you adopt a lot through the city, they send you this document and you sign it and send it back. And it is very jargony. It has a lot of legal concepts that most people probably don't understand. And it's not really negotiable, so you sign it or you don't sign it. So there's a few parts of the Adopt-A-Lot agreement. Some of you, if you were on the bus tour today, heard this referred to as a lease. It's not a lease, and the fact that people who have been gardening for a long time call it a lease kind of shows you how the city doesn't do a good job of explaining what the agreement is and what people's rights are. So people don't understand this agreement. And one thing I wanted to point out is that when you sign the license agreement, you're indemnifying the city against any harm related to the property or any of the sidewalks. So if someone walks down the sidewalk near an Adopt-A-Lot property that you've adopted and trips and hurts themselves, basically you're agreeing as a lot adopter to pay the city back for any kind of lawsuit that they have to, or any kind of damages that they have to pay out. I think a lot of people don't understand that implication. It could be pretty significant, which is why we always encourage our clients to sign on behalf of a community organization and not on behalf of just an individual neighbor, because you're taking on, if you sign the agreement on behalf of an individual, you're taking on a lot of responsibility for that lot.
Do they require any kind of proof of insurance or anything?
No, and actually, I've never heard of anyone being able to get liability insurance for an Adopt-A-Lot agreement, and this might just be a weird quirk of Maryland. Maybe other cities, I think New York provides liability, no, okay, sorry.
I can talk about New York.
It's easier to get liability insurance in other states. In Maryland, I've never heard of anyone who is gardening under an Adopt-A-Lot getting liability insurance for that.
So how does that legally work? How is the city insulated from that, just from this?
From the
deciding
law
to pay
adopter.
for? Really?
Yeah.
Up to a judge, right?
Right.
That's what my lawyers are asking me. so
Right.
I'm trying to-
All right,
Is it-
so
is it take over?
technically the city could come to you and say, please reimburse us for this, this damage that we had to pay for someone who hurt themselves on the sidewalk.
Can I
Do you
just,
have a question?
well, I just want to share a really quick experience.
Yeah.
I'm in New York, and I've been referring folks to the American Community Gardening Association's insurance brokers, and I have had people get insurance without having a license or a lease or anything.
Okay.
So that's good.
That is good. I've never heard of it happening in Baltimore City, but if it could happen, that would be amazing, because that would at least take care of some of the liabilities stuff in the agreement. So another thing in the adopt a lot lease agreement is that you have to notify the city in advance of applying for any funding for the garden and get written permission from the city. And then the final thing that people have brought up is that the city can terminate the agreement with 30 days written notice. And you know, they say that they will try, if you're growing crops or food of some kind, that they'll try to let you finish out the growing season, but they don't have to if they don't want to. And if you're breaking any of the rules in this long agreement with a lot of legalese, then they can terminate with 5 days notice. So we had thought, we knew, this is about a year ago, we had thought that adopting a lot through the license agreement meant that that lot wasn't put on the for sale list that the city is constantly updating and putting online. So we knew that the city could sell the land at any time, but we thought that there was some kind of step taken so that the land didn't go up on the for sale list. But that turned out to be not the case. I'm just going to tell a little bit of the story about what happened there. So let's see. So we realized after several adopted lots got listed on the Vacants to Value website, which is the for sale, the land that the city is trying to sell, that there's 2 categories, and there's a subcategory within adopted lots. So if you just sign this agreement and return it, you're in this larger category. And there was a subcategory that the city had created called protected green space. And those were the lots that they were removing from Vacants to Value for sale list. However, they didn't tell anybody about this secret category or tell anybody what the criteria were to be in that special category. Basically, this category meant that it was in community use, so the community was getting a benefit from the lot. And so we kind of pushed a little bit and said, you know, how would people know how to get their, because once people have started a project, they obviously want to be in this special category where their lot doesn't get aggressively marketed for sale. And for a long time, there were no criteria. It was basically the projects that the city had heard about through various greening organizations. It was very informal. So now, recently, within the past few months, they've come up with criteria for this protected green space category. So these are the 5 criteria. 2.5 years of existence, an identified site manager or steward, an existing adopt-a-lot license agreement, so an agreement that's valid and has been renewed, an intentional design, and serves a community purpose. So these are all still pretty squishy categories, but at least, they're criteria, but at least they now exist. The problem is that when you apply to adopt a lot, none of these criteria and none of this, sorry, whatever. There we go. Let's go back. I don't think I can. That's okay. The mouse might. Yeah, you're a good call. So none of this is on the city's website at all. It's not something that the city tells people about. It's not something that the city tells people they can work toward. The city doesn't tell anyone about the criteria. It's still kind of a secret category. But it has a lot of really important implications. And so I just kind of wanted to frame that whole issue in terms of the license agreement, because that's where the vast majority of these projects are, that's the program that they're in, but the city is not being forthright about how they're making their decisions and how they are trying to sell land or trying to protect land. And so really, I guess my suggestions for improvement are really not that we need to protect all the adopted lots, but just that there needs to be transparency in the process. So people need to know about the different categories, what they mean, and how they can where their project fits and how they can kind of make sure that their project is in the protected category. And ideally, I think all the licenses should be leases instead, but that's a different presentation. So I will pass it over to Wendall Holmes, who will talk to us about the leasing program in Baltimore City.
Good afternoon. My name is Wendall Holmes, and I'm associated with the group Strength of Love 2, and we operate the farm. I think maybe some of you went and visited today in Sandtown. We call it Strength of Love Farm. And our involvement, well, first of all, Strength of Love 2 is a mission group formed out of our church, Newborn Community of Faith Church in Sandtown. And that mission group, Strength of Love 2, is to be supportive of ex-offenders, citizens returning back to our community from incarceration. And so our involvement with urban agriculture is kind of incidental. And what I mean by that is that our mission is to provide jobs, training, and opportunity and other forms of support for our returning citizens. And so it was, I guess, about in early 2010, we were approached with this opportunity about urban agriculture. Big City Farms, located in South Baltimore, approached us through a sister organization that we affiliate with in Washington, D.C. Big City Farms was commencing to do hoop farms, and what they needed was network growers, folks interested in growing for them, and then they being the marketing arm of this initiative. So we were put in touch with them, and so, you know, it seemed like a likely venture to go into, since we were seeking to create jobs and opportunities for ex-offenders. So we agreed, and the rest is kind of history. But you know, we didn't know anything about farming or any of that. But we thought we'd go along for the ride, right? So it wasn't too long after that that the city put out a RFQ, and this was with the Homegrown Baltimore Initiative, an RFQ for those interested in taking vacant lots and turning them into green spaces or agricultural spaces. And so we applied, we submitted an RFQ, and when they came back, they said, well, sort of what you want to do kind of doesn't fit our particular model. And I think it was because of our connection with Big City Farms and our collaborative with Big City Farms. They put us in a special category. In the meantime, we did adopt a lot on Fremont Avenue, off of Pennsylvania Avenue, thinking that that might be the site where we wanted to erect these hoop houses. Then we saw this other, more attractive lot, and I think that's where you all visited today, which was larger and you know, enabled us to envision expanding beyond what we could do on Fremont Avenue. So the city sort of had us in a hold position, and I don't know if we're in that little inner circle that you were speaking about, but I suspect we're kind of in that kind of inner circle, because certainly we couldn't afford to begin a project like this and just have it you know, swept from under our feet, you know, at whim. And so our lease is a little extensive, and that was kind of like a long process, and a lot of legalese and a lot of going back and forth. And I'm not a legal person, and I really don't know all that's in the lease, but I know that what we did want to be assured of is that, you know, this thing would not be taken away from us. We started out with one hoop house on that site, and that was like in 2012. And so a year later, we've got 16 hoop houses there. So it's just snowballed. And it's really surprised us all, you know, how it has grown in that amount of time. But it is a lease with the city, and it is at least for 7 years, and it is renewable after that 7-year period. And like I said, the details of that lease and all the legalese that are in it, I'm not sure, but it was quite a process. It was at least probably about a 1.5-year process before we actually got the thing finalized. And with that, I guess we'll open it up for questions.
And,
Well,
thank you
turn
very
it
much.
into you.
I'll come
All right.
there, and then, thank you. So, Wendall actually stole my line, which is, at this point, we'll open it up for questions. But I wanted to just sort of, well, I wanted to ask the first question, basically, so I got to stand up here and do that. So it sounds like summing all of this up, and if it's okay, if y'all can just stay where you are, can everyone see okay, and we can turn chairs and talk to each other in more of a discussion? I'm gonna get out from behind the microphone in just a moment. So, but just to try to sum up what we've talked about, if the big issue here is getting access to these vacant lots, the big issue is taking something that's not in productive use, right, and shifting it to a use that is productive, that is not just sitting there, we might think of it as. What I could tell is the 3 big problems that y'all have either witnessed, experienced, gathered together are, first, the problem of getting legal access to the land. So just to go back to Wendall's, the legalese that was in the way, the 1.5 years that it took to get that. That proposes, or that's a substantial cost, a startup cost in this point. The second big problem is, once there is access, what's the guarantee, what's the durability, right? Going back to the concept of, you don't want to be setting something up only to find it sold out from under you, right, a year later. So we're looking at 7-year leases, or I'm sorry, yeah, possibly 7-year leases, licenses, something like that, but that can be sold out from under, and maybe organizations don't have enough money to get something more durable than that. That might require purchasing. And then a final issue that came up over the course of the talk is liability, right? We talked a bit about insurance, the indemnification agreements with the city. So the question I have, there's a question buried in here somewhere, is, one, are we missing another big issue? Is there another big issue on the table here that in your experience hasn't come out, or that I at least haven't listed here? And 2, within these 3 issues, you know, what have been the ways that the various farms in Buffalo and the land banks have helped to overcome that? How did y'all get through the 1.5-year process of trying to get this started up? Or you know, when it comes to advising other community groups and getting the transparency there, what has been the experience and process with that? So if y'all could share on that a little bit, and then we'll open it up to the usual, you know, if you have a question, kind of raise your hand, and I'll, just for order's sake, call on people. So I'll step out of the way. Question mark.
I guess I will answer that question. I think those are the 3. Should I?
Why don't you, yeah, if you don't mind standing.
Okay. I think those kind of are the big issues that come up for me anyway, over and over again, with working with community groups access to land is a really big one, so people don't really know where to start. There's land everywhere in Baltimore City that is lying vacant. There's no, work being done on it, but people feel a little bit helpless of where to start. And so being able to look up who owns a piece of land and have that inform what you do on that land or how you go about getting access to it, I think is useful to them. So kind of just taking things step by step. I spend a lot of time going over the steps to acquiring land. So looking up who owns land on the state's website, and then trying to track down that person. Let's see if they still are alive. Let's see if this corporation is still in good standing or is forfeited. So it's not complicated once you know where to look for the information. I guess that's a lot of what I do to kind of get past those issues, is to just take things step by step and to make sure that people have access to the information that they need by doing workshops and different things. There was kind of a long question, I'm not sure. I think I just answered a little part of it. Does anybody else have?
Well, I would say it is a little tenuous, and there are a lot of question marks. In our particular farm, a lot of it is city-owned, but it's dotted with privately owned little lots, and who owns that, and what happens, if they show up and, want to lay claim. That's a question mark, so I guess I'm leaving you with a question. But I'm just suggesting that, some of it is still a little unsorted out.